yourself who you think would be a good person to take part in the series. But today's presenter is Dr. Alia Amir, who's a research associate at SOAS, among other things, and who has published very widely on teaching English as a foreign language and on language policies and different language practices and multilingual scenarios. So we are very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say about today's topic, and I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much for this introduction. And I see many familiar faces and some new faces. So I'm looking forward to the discussion towards the end for those who are familiar and those who are not familiar with this research. As I mentioned to Laura earlier, I'm actually using Microsoft Teams on my browser. So I'll move on to the next browser. So I won't be able to see it, but I'm still here. So if you see my eyes moving in strange directions, it might be because I also have my notes and my PowerPoint on that other tab. All right. So as you see the title, there are a couple of words which I would like to talk about before I actually talk about the project and this research. And the two words are language policing and multilingualism. So this title basically reflects the intersection of two key phenomena in contemporary educational research. And language policing refers to the formal and informal regulation of language use in institutional settings. For example, Foucault has talked about it, and Blomet, among others. And I started working on this project in the Swedish context in the year 2009. So the findings are from 2009 to 2014, and then I have worked on the same phenomena in the Turkish context as well with colleagues' data from Turkey. And then multilingualism, as is understood by several researchers in different contexts with different theoretical frameworks, but I'm using Garcia and Leeway's understanding, which is that multilingualism is understood not merely as the coexistence of multiple languages, but as a dynamic and negotiated social practice shaped by power, identity, and policy. So let's move on to this first slide. So this research was conducted in the Swedish educational context, and it provides a very rich site for exploring the dynamics of language policy and language policing. While it is a classroom context where I analyze the language policing sequences with a very micro level approach, I see that these findings are very much useful in other communicative settings as well, not just in a classroom setting. And in such a multilingual classroom where I conducted this study, it affects both the participation and inclusion of the classroom participants, including the pupils, especially as the power dynamics indicated that those structures which were upheld by the teachers, the pupils were mostly impacted by that. It also helped me understand the dynamics, how inclusion and exclusion are not just merely terms used in macro context, but how it actually impacts in the micro contexts. And if I were to look at only the English, teaching of English, the goals of teaching of English, I saw that a lot of time, the class time actually was taken away by such kind of language policing, because in an English lesson, if there are only 60 minutes and there are a couple of language policing sequences, then class time is actually taken away from the actual activities where there was a lot of contestation and negotiation about which language was being spoken and who was speaking what, and whether they were adhering to the English-only policy or not. And some of the central questions for this research are that how do institutional rules and linguistic norms influence classroom language practices? In what ways do students and educators negotiate, resist, or reinforce language policing? And what do these interactions reveal about power and policy in multilingual education? Moving on to when I gathered this data, I narrowed down the questions for particular studies since I was using a very micro level methodology, which I'll talk about in the next few slides. So one of the main questions that I used to understand this English only enforcement was, what effects do the practices of doing language policy, which is policy in process, have on learning and teaching of English as a foreign language in that context? And to what extent do these practices align and disalign with the business of learning? For example, task accomplishment and teaching of EFL, as when language policing sequence was initiated, it was often that the task was not completed, but abruptly stopped in that moment. Okay, so some contextual background about English in education in Sweden. As you know, that English did not arrive in Sweden as um, as a as a sorry as a form of colonization, but English is quite huge in many respects in the Scandinavian context, and especially Sweden. So English is taught at the compulsory school level in Sweden from grades 1 to 9, which is up until when someone is 15 or 16 years old. That's the compulsory school education. It's a core subject, and you must pass it in order to get a certification for your compulsory school education. It's taught as in two different ways, as a subject, which is not called actually a foreign language or second language in any of the state level national policies, but it's also taught as a medium of instruction, as in many parts of the world, and it's also called CLIL, as we know. But in schools where it is used as a medium of instruction, the law states that Swedish language must be used for the first 50% of the subjects. So there are some international school or chains of schools which have English as a medium of instruction. And those English as a medium of instruction schools, again, can be categorized into two different kinds of schools: international bilingual schools and bilingual preschools, where there is some sort of policy that both languages are used either simultaneously or for certain activities. And these are my own categorizations and understandings. And besides this, that English language is used in the compulsory school level, English is used in higher education, both at the master's level, but for some programs at the bachelor's level and in other contexts as well. But it does not have any constitutional place in the Swedish policies. Okay, a few things about the data that I collected. So data was collected between the years 2007 and 2010 from an international Swedish secondary school, which was following the Swedish national curriculum. However, in that very school, there was another stream where international baccalaureate stream was also being followed. And when it comes to international, this was the word the school actually used. And for my own understanding, I gathered some things from like school corridors and the schools outside of school, where the school's title was. So there wasn't much which I could actually relate in terms of being international, except that there were few things which were in three languages, which was Swedish, English, and Spanish. And I collected data from grades 7 to 9, doing various activities. Initially, I was actually going to look at what they were doing with computers while in their English classrooms. They were doing a project on Swedish migration from Sweden to the United States of America. So a lot of the data that I've collected, they talk about Swedish migration from Sweden to the US. And these were 15 to 16 years old. And I use conversation analysis to understand practice language policy, which is a concept used by Florence Bonacina on Spolsky's understanding of language policy, where he talks about understanding policy in practices, and conversation analysis seems like a good tool to understand micro-level interactions and such practice policies. So those aspects which I've just talked about are contextual background about the school and a little bit about English in Sweden. So English, as you know, is not the natural language used in interaction in these environments. There are textual references. Sometimes you might find some bilingual signboards. It is a foreign language or a second language, and there's a lot of debate in articles from various researchers who consider it either as a foreign language or a second language, but there is also research which calls it extramural English, when you find English outside of classroom situation. It can be used widely in certain domains and contexts, as I've spoken about earlier, like in gaming and music and higher education. So I guess this is quite enough for our purposes. And these are some photographs from the linguistic landscape of Stockholm, Sweden, where you can see that the first photograph actually shows a monolingual menu in Swedish, and then some photographs from political parties' boards in central Stockholm. And then you can find a little bit of multilingualism or bilingualism, actually, Swedish and English. And you can see that you actually need a lot of a different kind of literacy to understand such a map. Okay, and then conversation analysis. So when you're using conversation analysis and collect data with video recordings, the video recorded data is looked through for any phenomena that sticks out of that recording. And once you have found a phenomena which aligns with what you are actually looking for, then you kind of make a collection of those incidences or aspects of phenomena. In my case, which is language policing, when I found one interaction where language policing was being initiated, so I looked at all the data and collected those and transcribed them in detail, which are forensically transcribed by measuring pauses and overlaps, as well as intonation and other aspects in spoken speech. I'll show you more about this when we have the transcript. And I'm also using Paul Seedhouse's classroom contexts. I won't go much into detail about this because similar to Paul Seedhouse, there are other educational linguists and people who have worked with English language teaching who have used these contexts in these kind of categorizations, but have other labels. But I'm using Paul Seedhouse because it aligns quite well with the research data. So he talks about 4 different kinds of classroom contexts, not just in English language classrooms, but any kind of second or foreign language classroom context, which is form and accuracy, meaning and fluency, procedural, and task-oriented. And I found that these categorizations were quite good to use in analyzing language policing in a classroom context where I was working with. And I found that in each of these contexts, language policing's interaction or trajectory looked quite different, and also the impact was quite different. So when I finalized the findings, so I don't actually talk about a language policing impact in all four contexts, because all four contexts had different impact. And then this three-way view of context, according to Paul Seedhouse, the institutional L2 classroom context, and this micro context, which you see in the middle, this is where my research is located. And I see that even though there is impact of institutional context, L2 classroom context, and even wider national context and other discourses as well. But if you just focus on the micro context and its findings, then the findings can be connected with the other contexts as well. So this is the same thing which I talked about earlier, that Paul Seedhouse talks about, that every time a teacher introduces a pedagogical focus in orientation to which learners produce turns in the L2, and L2 context is talked into being. So if the pedagogical focus is language policing, that becomes part of the talk, and another context is generated. And I'll show you this through some examples. I won't go much into detail about these two things, but task as work plan and task in process are also two concepts used by Seedhouse based on Breen's categorization. Task as work plan, as you know, is the plans that a teacher make before a classroom, and task in process is what happens in actual classroom. And my understanding of language policing is based on language policing or micro level language policy in process, and how it changes minute by minute, turn by turn. It's negotiated, it happens here and now between the classroom participants, even though a language policy of a nation state or institutional policy might state something else, but it happens in between the participants in interaction. So I'll move on to the next slide. So policy in process. So similar to what I've just described earlier, language policy in process captures the playing out of policy in situ as opposed to the policy as work plan conceived by the policymakers. So in my context, the English language teachers of that school had actually made a language policy as work plan, which was that every lesson had 40 points, and it was a rule, English only rule, conducted through that point system, and it was a teacher versus pupils point system. It also included the penalty to the teacher if the teacher spoke Swedish, which is that if the teacher spoke one word of Swedish, 1 point could be given to the pupils. And when they accumulated about 1,000 points, they were given a free lesson, a free period to watch a movie. And I'm told that that happened every term. And I'll move on to this one. I've already talked about it. So when it comes to language policing trajectory, it happened in such a way that there was either a perceived breach of the target language only rule. So somebody spoke Swedish or French or German or Arabic or Somali or any other language. And then an act of language policing was initiated of the need to switch the language back to English. And in the third step or the turn, an orientation to the target language only rule by the person who had either breached the policy or was perceived to have breached the policy. So for example, if somebody said, speak English, and if somebody hadn't been speaking English, they will switch to English in the next turn. And in the third turn, there was a switch, which is also a repair, as is used in the code switching research. And in my research, I found out that these were the different types of language practices in this context. And I have in the middle both translanguaging and code switching. And as we know that translanguaging is quite popular these days, but in if you look at both code switching research and translanguaging, they're both talking about similar things, but from a different angle. Code switching research like Peter Auer and Gafaranga and others are using, and translanguaging by Levi and others. And my research is based on Gafaranga's model of medium switching. He calls it medium, and medium mixing, medium switches, and medium, which I have used in this as well. So ideally, the teachers wanted that there was monolingual English, but as we know that there was a shift between all these variations, even if we call them translanguaging or code switching, and somewhat monolingual Swedish as well. But since these were interactionally competent pupils, as I would say, based on data collection from other schools as well, there was a lot of monolingual English, both by the teachers and the students. And I'll show you in a while. And these are the 3 different types of policing practices that I'm actually going to talk about the second one and the third one. The first one is self-referencing or self-policing, where you, if you switch to second language or any other language, you yourself switch back to the target language in a classroom context, and that happens quite a lot, that you're self-regulating because of that policy, and in this case, a game like a rule, the point system, which I've just talked about. And this is the same. Okay, so now I have one of the excerpts from the data, and you see both the transcript and a small photograph from that classroom. So this is the picture from the computer lab, and you see 4 heads or 4 pupils, I would say, but the transcript is actually focused on these 2 girls in green and black and white. The one in green is Hannah, not her real name, and the other one is Maureen on the right-hand side. And you see that there is a computer screen in front of them, and then on the left there are another pair of students working on the same quiz, and this quiz was actually about different aspects, and I'll walk you through this transcript first. So in the first line, Hannah says, and I'll read the English translation and skip the Swedish one for now. She says, yeah, but it must be Afghanistan, isn't it? She's asking the girl on the right, and as you can see, she has her hand on the mouse, and Marlene actually has a piece of paper and pencil, and she's writing down what is being said. So line 1, one would categorize it as Swedish, right? It's completely in Swedish, and then in the light gray, you see it's the translation of what's on line 1, and then below it you see some notes about how this was being delivered. So for example, 8.5 is the time measured between line 1 and line 2 and measured through a software, and then in the brackets is the how or what is being happening in this, where you see that H scrolls, which is Hannah, scrolls around Wikipedia entry for Afghanistan. So they're reading about Afghanistan on the screen, and the entry is from Wikipedia. And then Hannah says, and as you can see that she has now switched to English, and it's not complete, and she doesn't fully utter what she's saying, and she says the Islamic and she then returns to Google and then turns over to page 2 in the sheet where this is written, and then she switches back to Swedish, line 3, and she says must be that, and then Malin briefly looks up, and then so H moves pencil to the second column, and then she in line 7 moves back to Swedish. And then in line 9, there is a mixed medium, as we call it, And she says, water then dara, or where is that? And then she reads the capital city of Iraq. There's a pause between city and of Iraq. There must be Afghask, and it must be Afghanistan. And in line 10, in an overlap while Hannah is reading Mostavi Afghans, Molin says Prata Engelska, which is speak English, and this is the main focus of my research, which is language policing. And this act of language policing, as you can see, is formulaic, which happens in all over the data, not just in this context, but we see that in the Turkish context as well, that these statements come out as a form of like a in this pattern. So it could be Prata Engelska or speak English. Sometimes it's in English as well. But as you see that ironically here, she's asking Hannah to speak English, but she's herself uttering this in Swedish. And as you see, those two tiny dot-like circles above Prata Engelska mean that this has been said in a very low and meek voice. So it's not as loud as Hannah's. So it's lower than Hannah's. Hannah, and so there is a pause, and then Hannah actually switches to English. She says yes, and then there's a pause, and she says wait. So this impact of after language policing in the next turn in my data, I've seen these examples or these excerpts collected from all this data, where this happens all the time, that whenever there is policing, there is a switch to the target language or the English only rule. So I'll pause here and give you a bit of a global understanding of this as well. So the task or the quiz that they have is written down in English, and they get this instruction by the teacher at the beginning of the class as well, when again in a formulaic way the teacher reminds them to keep on speaking English and not to switch to Swedish. But another aspect is that she does not take into account any other language. She does not mention any other language. She only talks about as if there are two languages in this classroom, whereas I hear all the other languages as well. And another aspect is that since the pupil's task is to fill in this quiz, and I think there were about 10 questions that they needed to fill, and from different aspects, political, art, and music, and other aspects. So they're finding information to fill that. And what happens is that while they're reading that in English, they have opened the Wikipedia entry for Afghanistan. So they are basically drawing all that information and putting that in that text. But as you see that in line 10 to 11 to 12, there isn't much time that has been wasted in this context. And this is a task-based context, as I mentioned, the Paul Sidas's categorization. Okay, so I'll move on to line 13 now. So she starts writing Afghanistan, and she says it's Afghanistan. And Molin, as you see, there are two X's. It's not audible what she says, but there was a question-like intonation. So she questions somewhat what's being said after a long pause. And these pauses, of course, mean that they're working and doing something. It's not that they're empty. And then Molin leans over its pen, and then there is some sort of a laughter at the end. But as you see, after policing in line 10, there is only English being spoken. So policing does have an impact, as I see in these examples.
Just sorry to interrupt, Alia. Just to let you know, that's your half-hour warning that you asked.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm just going to go over to the second example. So this example is from a different set of pupils, but with the same teacher. And she's actually working on a grammar quiz as well. And as you can see that she has, I hope it's not too cut, but she actually has a transparency. And as you can see, she has light over that transparency, which is being displayed on the wall in the front, and everybody's looking at it. And she's going, what she was doing at that point was that she was going through the answers of that grammar quiz. And when I recorded these pupils, they were in grade 9, so the senior most class of the school, which were going to have national exam. And as I could hear them and understand what was going on, that they did have a lot of interactional competence. But what happened in the grammar class was that that this particular question, number 10, which the teacher is talking about in line 9, so the blank could have either wasn't or weren't. So she says number 10, if it, and John on the left says wasn't, and somebody says were, and then there's a pause, and somebody again says were, and Sarah on the left says wasn't, and then you see like a regular classroom chatter. People are speaking when the teacher asks a question. And then you get an evaluation, like in a sequence. Teacher says, people say wasn't, and wasn't is completely okay, but weren't is actually correct. So she gives an explanation about what she thinks is the right answer. And then she draws a ring. So she writes like this, like a C around weren't on transparency. And Sarah, the student on the left, she says, huh? And the teacher, after a pause, says, yep, and yeah. And then Sarah again says, perhaps, even. So the teacher says the wasn't is becoming more and more acceptable because of if. So there was a if at the beginning of this sentence, a conditional. And in Swedish, she says, this is easy because you say, and when she says because, she starts writing the word ver in Swedish, which is vore, with a V-O-R-E. And she says, you say like this, don't you say wo. And she says half of the Swedish word, and then she leaves it there and self-polices herself because of the strange rule that they had created. And then John says, ah, oh, and Mikhail must be the, and then she gives an explanation in line 26 where she says, I didn't say the whole thing, but isn't is this, smiles and look towards the students, and then she makes a fan movement with the left hand because the word, the alphabet written in Swedish is different from in English. So in this whole context, you see that she was about to switch in line 18 into Swedish, but she self-polices and keeps it into English. But if she had actually explained, even if she just used this one word in Swedish and given some translation, it would have worked. But she goes on and polices herself and gives an explanation. And as you can see, she uses the pronouns you say like this, as if Swedish is being only used and spoken by them. And this is the continuation of the same excerpt. And as you can see that she had actually written, she actually started reading with W, but then she corrected it to V. And it's the question number 10, where she has circled weren't. And the teacher then teasingly asks, how do you spell it? Because she had already repaired everything and she doesn't get caught for speaking Swedish in this class. So John says with a V, and she says, aha, V, right, okay. So, okay, you right, you use the word in Swedish, don't you? And she changes the W into V here. And John says yes. And that's the same as our were. And she was a native English speaker of US English. But she was also fully um, competent in Swedish too. And then she continues to say, if I weren't too late, you use that word in Swedish, but wasn't as becoming more popular yet. So you see that it's after when she does policing to this point. So it's line 17 to line approximately 37 to 38. So it took quite a long time to explain that. Similar to this excerpt, she in another point in class, not the same day, she was actually talking about her husband who speaks like people from the region of Småland. So she uses the word Småland and another word, and she gets policed by the students that she has actually spoken Swedish, whereas she was just using a proper noun. And that I've seen sometimes happen in other classes as well. For example, the same teacher was actually talking about the Swedish school authority, and she doesn't use the word, and she says, you know, the name, the school authority. She doesn't say the word Skolverket, and she uses that translation as well. So the question is, if you have an English only rule, how do you make sure that if there are no translations in other languages, if that's also considered like a breaking the sanctity of the English only rule or not? Okay, I hope I wasn't speaking too fast, but we've come to the end of the examples. So what I found out was that a target-only rule can be mobilized by pupils to justify not only conveying meaning, but doing so precisely, coherently, and appropriately. In some moments in this school and class, there was a very strict interpretation of the monolingual principle, which wasn't supposed to be violated. But when you have a strict interpretation of the monolingual principle, it can still be violated. But if there is L1 as a scaffold, that can work as well. And doing language policy, I found out that there were two ways that the language policy can be done, which is both explicitly and implicitly. And explicitly is with words and collocations like speak English or reminders and other aspects, and implicitly is that you just switch back to English. So doing language policy explicitly typically involves side sequences that take longer time, that put the current interactional business on hold and may prove disruptive to the classroom context. And between pupils, if there's a language policing sequence, which we saw in the first example, it's typically shorter than if it's between the teacher and the pupils. It's short and unintrusive trajectory. So the trajectories are quite different in each type of policing. And it typically occasions a return to the target language. In language teaching contexts, the avoidance of the L1 underpinned by a point deduction system may not be disruptive of the business at hand, but also counterproductive to the pedagogical work plan. And other more extensive and disruptive language policing sequences include challenges of other policing, for example, teacher to pupil and pupil to teacher, which often underpinned by a point deduction system. And I've come to the end of my PowerPoint. And I'll come back here. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. Any thoughts or?
That was great. Thank you very much. So does anybody want to either, if you aren't able to unmute yourself, you can type a question in the chat and I'll read it out for you. Or if you would like to ask a question, then please raise your hand, either using the raise hand button or, just by putting your hand up. You have to have your camera on for that to work though. If not, I'll begin. Well, maybe I have a question about this point deduction policy then, because it sounds like something that would work, like it would be quite an incentive for me when I'd be, gamifying that and trying to earn the points. But obviously you showed that it was disruptive, or not disruptive, counterproductive in some ways. Like, did you find that there's a sort of happy medium or something where it can work well if you don't have that extremely strict policy that you talked about?
Sorry, I missed some bits of what you said.
So you said it can be counterproductive, but I can also see how it would be very incentivizing for students.
Oh, yes. So,
does
yeah,
it work well generally, apart from that
yes.
very strict rule?
So I would say that generally the policy, how it was formulated or created by the English language teachers of that school, the aim was to provide a space where they could have a space where they could practice English, because naturally outside the classroom there is no space where they would practice more English. So that's the incentive. And as I've also recorded some points where the teacher enters the classroom and you hear Swedish, actually, Swedish or other languages being spoken in the classroom. And the teacher enters and she says, "Good morning" in English. And there's a switch to English. So that's like beginning the lesson proper by switching it to English. So that the teacher's aims and intentions, of course, are well informed about the participants' English language capabilities and what they need to do in those 50 minutes or 60 minutes that they have for this. Counterproductive it can become if the rule is enforced 100% of the time, or if the aim is to keep it completely English all the time. And it becomes absurd for, as I mentioned, if there are no city names, proper names in English, what do you do about it? And also, I should also say that in the data that I collected in 40 hours, there are actually only 3 instances of a point deduction. So another finding of mine from this data is that they actually uphold English without any policing most of the time. But since my focus is on those few instances of policing, both explicit and implicit and point deduction, it might seem like that. But I do analyze that some of those language policing instances can be counterproductive in terms of that it takes more time, or one could just use the word in Swedish. And another aspect I should mention is that all other languages actually become invisible. So even though the pupils come from many different language backgrounds, you don't actually hear any other languages, which could be that there might not be other pupils who are speaking those languages together. But also in terms of English, those who had more interactional competence, or those who were more extrovert, actually took the interactional floor, I would say. So those who were shy or could not speak English, they were actually silenced, I would say, in other ways.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Hannah, you've lowered your hand. Have you?
I also had a question about the point system, so maybe you could go to the questions that are in the chat, and then if we have time, I can ask it afterwards.
Sure. Okay, Fazia's also got a hand up as well. So, Fazia, do you want to ask your question next, and then I'll read out the 2 that are in the chat.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Laura. This is Fazia Shamim from Pakistan. This was quite fascinating because, we have lots of multilingualism in South Asia and African countries, but too, we have an example from Europe. My question was, and I think Alia did probably sort of touched upon it in her last comment, all research in our context tells us that an English-only policy results in silencing the learners, results in learners having this kind of an identity crisis, a feeling there's a deficit. They are unable to be creative. They are unable to have a voice in the classroom. The participation are very low. English-only classrooms. is that something that you, or probably, I know that wasn't the focus of your research, but Alia, able to find something similar in the Swedish classrooms also?
Yes, indeed. Actually, I would agree with that. As I mentioned, so this was an international school. So I wouldn't say this is like a regular Swedish school, because we collected data from some other schools as well, where English lessons were being conducted in complete Swedish. There was no English spoken at all, both by the teacher and the pupils. So I would say these are different shades of language policies in different classrooms, like around the world as well. And since the focus was on looking at how the language policing mechanism worked, I believe there were pupils who did not have enough interactional competence, who did not speak or took the interactional flow because of their pronunciation or because of their perceived incompetence in English language, I would say. So yes, I would say that it might have happened that they were not speaking in the classroom or participating in the classroom as others who were more vocal or had more competence.
Mm-hmm. And just one more follow-up question on, you said all other languages were invisible in the classroom. So that seems to ring a bell, because
Yes.
we talk about languages in Pakistan, for example, we talk about Urdu and English, the national language and the international language, and all other languages, 13, 14, 15 in one classroom, they're
Yes.
all invisible. So, how does that impact? Because initially you identified multilingualism as having to do with identity also. So how does it impact the identity of these children? And not particularly, not just the international school, but I would be more interested in your other data, which is like, the regular schools.
Yeah, I would say that, as you've mentioned, the Pakistani context, I would say it's a very multilingual context, the language classrooms, and in Sweden as well, multilingual is growing. And if I were just to talk about this classroom that I presented today, even though I did not gather information about the other languages, but I'm aware that they were speaking other languages too, outside the classroom and inside the classroom as well. But I would say this is also quite, I would say, something that, it's not the English only policy that has made other languages invisible in this data, but other aspects or other policies in the school where mother tongue speaking was not allowed. It wasn't appreciated. It wasn't even allowed in the playgrounds, for example, or corridors. So English still hold, in this context, in this microcosm of this school, English was still allowed or had a much higher, I would say, prestige and place than other languages. So I would say all those things have had a knock-on effect on the data that I gathered or got.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Denise's
Hmm.
question has in the chat, so obviously been partly answered, but it sort of follows on from that. So I don't know if you can see it, but she says, unless you want to unmute Denise, you're very welcome to. She says that it was fascinating because, as you said, English is not a colonial language in Sweden, but there's still buy-in from schools, despite the wasted learning time. She asks about them being international schools, which you said they were, and she asks, how often did you see multilingual signs or displays in the schools?
Yeah, so this data that I collected was from the Swedish stream of this international school. So this was a school with very, I would say, hybrid policies in effect, and the school itself calls it international. So it has the word international in its name. And as I mentioned, as I consider Scandinavian countries where English hasn't reached, like in Pakistan and India through British colonization, I still find it much stronger, even though I find that the discourses in Scandinavian countries about English language are much different, and also people have a different kind of a connection with English language as in South Asia, since we have talked about South Asia, and Fawzia Shamim has also mentioned that. This was an international school in a relatively small city, I should say. I can't say much about where I collected the data because of ethical reasons, obviously. And the multilingual signs I could find, so there was, I would say, there were many policies in play in this school. So visibly, I could see these 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Swedish. Like the welcome sign, okay, only outside the school. So very, I would say, basic 3 words. And then inside the school, in the corridors, mostly you could see either English or Swedish. But for instance, the Institute of Folk is Institute of IFF, the Swedish authority, says that about 200 languages are currently being used or spoken in Sweden. And these include many immigrant languages from Asia and Africa, Arabic being one of the big languages, and Somali being another, and Turkish being another, and Bosnian, and so on and so forth. These languages were not appreciated or allowed, as I said, in the language, in the playground and other places. So there were policies over there as well. And for example, there was an English stream within this international school where the teachers had actually forbidden, because I actually sat in those classes and took notes as well. So mother tongues were completely forbidden in those classes, except, of course, English. Yeah. So I hope I answered your question. How this came about. Okay, so I can talk about teachers, how it came about.
Yeah, so the other question that's in the chat for people who can't see it is from Tracy, who asks about the teachers, how the approach came about, whether all the teachers agreed on the particular approach, and what, if any, consequences there might be for teachers if they did not follow it.
Did you mean by approach, do you mean the approach that I took, the theoretical framework, methodology?
I think she's talking about the English-only
policy.
Police themselves about using English.
English-only policy was, so many of the English language, I should also mention this, many of the English language teachers in this school were actually from the US and the UK, a few from Nigeria as well, for example. So English-speaking countries, or how Kachru calls the, has those categorizations. So the English-only approach was kind of a discussion between the English classes at different levels. And they believe that in order to teach English, only English should be used. But I should also mention that in teaching of Swedish as well, like teaching Swedish to adults, in those contexts as well, Swedish only is preferred. So there is that idea that languages should only be taught through the medium of the medium that is being taught. And I should say that the translanguaging research, or the recent research on the use of L1 probably hasn't yet been incorporated in teaching practices. But also, if I were to talk about Skolverket, the Swedish Educational Authority, it talks about the value of English, importance of English. It doesn't actually mention how that should be taught, but there is this general idea. But in practice, I wouldn't say that it's enforced 100%. People do switch, as you know, between Swedish and English. And if there are other languages in play, then people might use that as well. I hope I answered your question, Tracy.
Yeah, she says thank you. And follow up, was English the medium for all other curriculum subjects, or was that Swedish or
No, English was not the medium for the other curriculum subjects. So they studied science and social studies and mathematics in Swedish. And then Swedish, so another language is obviously Swedish as a language. And then from grade 7, they can choose between one of the modern languages, which is Spanish, German, and French.
Great. Thank you.
And also, sorry, mother tongue teaching, which actually is only done after school. And if you have, like, in one municipality, 7 pupils who have the same language, then they can study mother tongue with a mother tongue teacher.
Great. Alex, I see you're typing. You can unmute if you want to. In the meantime, Hannah, was your question answered? Oh, thanks, Alex.
Yeah, I think it's been answered through some of the discussions. So yeah, thanks very much.
All right. In that case, are there any last questions, or if not, then I think we'll just thank our speaker again, Dr. Alia Amir, for a really fascinating talk and discussion, and really nice to see those different ways of policing language. I don't know if nice is the right word, but interesting to see those ways of policing language in those classrooms. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing this, like, obviously vast amount of work that you've done with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. And if there are any other language policing contexts which you would like me to have a look, I'd be happy to collaborate and even discuss what you have. I should also mention then, besides I think I mentioned besides the Swedish context, we looked at Turkish data from a primary school, and we found that there were similar aspects there. So happy to look into those aspects if you have. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. All right. Well, as I say, this was the last of this year's series. Please do, I put a link in the chat earlier on for nominating yourself or someone else for next year's series. Please do that, or just drop me or one of the other organisers a message. But otherwise, thank you all very much for coming today, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.